The Birdcage.
I drink too much when the rain falls down. Hard to say no to that whiskey drown. And when I sleep, I just hear your voice. Why did you choose me when you had no choice? And I will love you, bluebird, in the dusk when the sun goes down. And I will love you, bluebird, in the morning when the stars all drown. And I will love you, bluebird, every hour of every day.
Nick Cunningham had his arm around the heaving shoulders of his colleague. "I'm so sorry about Katie. What can I do, buddy? Tell me how I can help you." His colleague said nothing. He just sat with his hand over his eyes. "You know, we've been through many things together. Seen many things together. We've seen people assaulted, murdered, raped. We've seen the evil things in this world. We know that bad things happen to good people. It's all bullshit. But we go home at night, we get on with our lone lives, and we try and forget it all for a few hours, before it's time to go back and face it all again." Cunningham sighed. "I know you had that with Katie. I know she was your slice of calm after a depressing day. Somehow you've just got to go... You've just got to try and remember that. And move on." Claire Mercer was sitting in front of her dressing table, brushing her hair in the mirror, when her husband Johnny came in, with his briefcase and grey suit. His tie was already off. He kissed his wife on the cheek. "Evening, darling. How was your day?" "Lazy. How was yours?" "Ugh, hectic. I'm just going to get changed and then I'm going out with the lads." He undressed and headed into the adjacent bathroom, where he showered. Claire continued to brush her hair in a slow and deliberate manner, while she listened to the sound of running water and the occasional snippets of whistling. When he returned, he dried himself with the large green cotton towel she had bought him last Christmas. He was still whistling to himself. He was always jovial when he was going out with the lads, his two colleagues from work. Claire had met them only once before, when they came to pick him up from the house. Apart from that, she knew nothing about them, or about anything else connected to his job. They never talked about it. Coming to think of it, they rarely really talked at all. Johnny's life was his work and his friends, and when he had any spare time, he would make love to Claire and tell her he loved her. "Don't wait up for me," he said as he left. She listened to his feet descending the stairs and the sound of the front door closing. Then she picked up the phone on her dressing table and dialed a number. "It's me. He's just left." "I'm pregnant." Cunningham stared at his wife. Then he started to laugh. "Pregnant? Sweetheart, that's brilliant news. Bloody hell, by the way you were talking, I thought someone had died." His wife, Helen, looked like somebody had. She stood on the other side of the kitchen counter from him, her face like a stone. "Isn't that a good thing?" he asked. "No." Cunningham frowned. "Why not?" "Why not?" she echoed. "There's about 3 billion reasons why not. That's how many atrocious things happen in this world. Murders, rapes, suicides, car accidents, you name it. Helen, calm down." He went over to his wife and held her. "You're just getting yourself worked up." "I'm worked up enough already, and now this. How can I be pregnant? We've always used condoms." Well, these things happen sometimes. Come and sit down. Let me get you some tea." "I don't want tea." "Something a little stronger then." He stroked her cheek with his thumb. "Have you taken your medication this morning?" "Why would you ask that?" "I'm just wondering." She slapped his hand away from her face and stared at him coldly. Cunningham straightened up. He walked over to the window and looked out onto the back garden, a sorry stretch of turf with a little shed at the back. He now imagined a toddler on a climbing frame, Helen sitting on the patio reading a book in the sunshine, and himself cooking sausages over a barbecue. "What do you want to do, Helen? Do you want to abort it?" He turned from the window. Is that what you're saying? She didn't answer him. She was staring into space. What can I do, sweetheart? How can I help? Tell me. Quit your job. Move to the country. Get out of this dump of a city. At least there we might be safe. At least there I could consciously consider bringing a baby into this shitty world. Cunningham sighed. He folded his arms. You're asking me to quit my job. A job I've just started. We moved to this dump of a city so I could take up a new position as a detective. You know what a detective does. He solves crimes. He tries to make this shitty world a better place. And in doing so, he immerses himself in it. And he brings it home with him. He brings it home. She looked at him now. Our home. I'm feeling insecure enough as it is. The lock on that front door is useless. It wouldn't take much to get through it. And those windows, anyone could throw a brick through them. Yeah, and then I would arrest them. If they couldn't kill you first. Jesus Christ, woman. Don't talk like that, Nick, she screamed. It's bad luck to take the Lord's name in vain. Do you want to jinx us? Oh, shut up, Helen. Just shut up. You think it's easy for me living with this? Helen was starting to cry. She covered her ears with her hands. Look at you. You need help. The psychiatrist we found obviously isn't enough. His pager suddenly began buzzing on his hip. He unclipped it and looked at the little screen. I have to go. We'll talk about this later. He paused and sighed again. Will you be all right? She was still sobbing, her hands still over her ears. He went over and squatted down in front of her. Gently he took her by the wrists and eased them away. I have to go. She suddenly grabbed him. Don't! I'm sorry I shouted at you. It's not that, it's work. Listen, will you go and see Jenny while I'm away? Don't stay in the house on your own. You need company. Go and do some shopping. You hear me? She nodded. Look, just remember I love you. He kissed her and hugged her to him. I'm sorry I'm like this, she sobbed. It's all right, he said. It's all right. Cunningham parked his car 20 yards from the tent and got out. Sergeant Thomas Bolton greeted him. Morning, Nicholas. Morning. What's the story? Shallow grave. Dog dug it up. The owner's over there, being sick. Are these woods a popular dog walking location? Asked Cunningham. Yes, why? Just asking. The killer might have chosen this site specifically. He might know it. Sergeant Bolton nodded. They ducked into the tent. Jim Torrance, the coroner, was on his knees. How long has it been here? Asked Cunningham. Morning, detective. This fellow's been here, I would say, just over a week. Any idea how he died? No. I'll need to get him back to the mortuary to have a look. What about identification? I haven't checked yet. Cunningham slipped on a pair of rubber gloves and squatted down to examine the man's body. He looked in his pockets. He found a wallet, inside of which was a driver's license. Mr. Johnny Mercer. Resided at number 8 Pine Tree Avenue. Where's that? Posh part of town, said Bolton. Maybe another 10 years with the force and you'll be able to afford a house there. Good. But where is it? On the east side of Midchapel, near the theatre. Cunningham nodded. He continued to search through the wallet. He pulled out a card. The Birdcage? It's a strip club, said Bolton. Is that in the posh part of town too? Bolton shook his head. Not quite. It's on Portland Street. Well, our man's obviously been there. The image on the card was the outline of a birdcage, set against a backdrop of blue feathers. He put the wallet and its contents, including the card, in an evidence bag and sealed it. I'll go and speak to the dog walker, he said. The woman was drinking tea out of a polystyrene cup. Her hands were shaking. Her dog, Bruno, was sitting quietly at her feet. Mrs. Wellington? She nodded. How are you feeling now? Shaken up. I understand. It was a nasty shock. Can you run me through exactly what happened? I was just walking Bruno, as I do. He was off the lead. I always let him run free here. He had been gone for some time. I kept calling and calling, but he wasn't coming back, so I went looking for him. I knew he'd found something that was occupying him, but I never... She shuddered and took another sip of tea. I took one look at what he was digging up and just about screamed. The body is in a shallow grave, but do you think Bruno uncovered all of it, or was some of it already exposed? I have no idea. Okay. Do you walk here often? I've been coming here for 15 years, ever since my husband and I moved here. We haven't always had him. She stroked her dog's head. It was Puggins before. This is a popular spot, I understand. Is it usually just people from the surrounding area that walk here, or from further afield? I would say it was mostly locals. I know most of them. It's like a social meeting place in these woods. Later, as they walked up the path of number 8 Pine Tree Avenue, Bolton said, Mrs. Mercer reported her husband missing a week ago, after he failed to return home from a night out. This isn't going to be fun. When is breaking this kind of news to people ever fun? This is the worst part of the job. They rang the doorbell and waited. It was opened a moment later by a woman in a dressing gown. Mrs. Mercer? Yes. My name is Detective Nick Cunningham. This is Sergeant Bolton. Did you report your husband missing, Mrs. Mercer? She just stared at them for a moment and then said, Yes. What is it? Do you think we could come in for a second? Asked Cunningham. She stood aside and opened the door wider. She showed them into a plush living room with a marble fireplace. Mrs. Mercer, I'm sorry to tell you that your husband's body was found in a shallow grave about 3 hours ago. Mrs. Mercer slowly began shaking her head. No, she muttered. I'm really very sorry. Ma'am, why don't you sit down? Said Bolton gently. Mrs. Mercer suddenly burst into floods of tears and dropped onto the sofa. Bolton sat down next to her. Oh my God! She wailed. Ma'am, have you any idea where your husband was going the night he disappeared? She shook her head. All I know is he was going out with the lads. They could have gone anywhere. Have you got any names for the lads? Daniel McDermott and Hector Finnegan. They're his colleagues from work. They always hung out. Do you have any contact details for them? Again, she shook her head. Mrs. Mercer, have you any idea who might have wanted to hurt your husband? She laughed ironically. He was a defense lawyer. He could have had any number of enemies. McDermott and Finnegan, were they defense lawyers too? Yes. Have you ever heard of a place called the Birdcage? No, she replied, wiping her eyes. Why? Your husband had a card from the Birdcage in his wallet. He might have been there that night. What is it? Cunningham paused a beat. It's a strip club. Again, she laughed. You don't seem too surprised about that. 3 men? Alcohol? No wives? No, Detective. I'm not surprised. We'll need to know the name of the company your husband worked for. Barton and Forrester, she said. Half an hour later, they entered the offices of Barton and Forrester. Mr. Barton greeted them. What can I do for you, gentlemen? We want to speak to 2 of your employees, Mr. McDermott and a Mr. Finnegan. I'm sorry, they're not here. They haven't been here for the last week. Cunningham looked at the sergeant. That's very interesting, he said. Would you have their addresses on file? Of course. As Barton went off to fetch them, Cunningham said, This doesn't feel good. No, it doesn't. Do you think there are 2 other bodies out there, in the shallow graves? I hope not. Let's go and speak to their wives, too. They visited the McDermott residence first. This time the door was opened by the cleaning lady. Is Mr. McDermott in? Asked Cunningham. She paused. Are you looking for my husband? Said a voice from the top of the stairs. That's right, said Cunningham, looking up. That makes 2 of us. Sheila McDermott took a long drag from her cigarette and sipped on a brandy. He came home to get changed and went out again. That's the last I saw of him. And this was on the 21st? She nodded. When I woke up the next morning, he wasn't in bed. It was obvious he hadn't come back at all. I didn't think anything of this. He might have stayed over with one of them. Either that or sometimes they stayed out all night. It wasn't until I tried several times to contact him on his mobile without success that I began to worry. He always answers his phone, except when he's in court. Cunningham nodded. Bolton was watching him write all this down on a pad. What do you think has happened to him, Detective? Cunningham sighed. Ma'am, he paused. I can tell you that one of his friends was found dead earlier this morning. The glass of brandy fell from Sheila's grasp onto the white carpet. Bolton caught her before she fell. Ma'am, we haven't found any other bodies yet. We still need to determine what's going on. But this is now a murder investigation, and we need to track your husband as soon as possible. They found the same information at Finnegan's house. His wife hadn't seen him since the 21st. 3 men, same night, 1 body. 1 down, 2 to go, said Bolton. Don't get ahead of yourself, Sergeant, said Cunningham. What do you want to do now? I want to speak to the coroner, see if he has any more information on cause of death. And then? Then I fancy going to a strip club. Blue light shone down on the body. The mortuary had a horrible chemical smell to it, and it was making Cunningham sick. Cause of death was strangulation. The hyoid bone is broken, and you can see the ligature marks on their throat and neck. Cunningham examined them. I've never seen ligature marks like that. What caused them? A metal chain. Good God, he muttered. The Birdcage opened at 8 p.m. It was 8:45 when Cunningham and Bolton arrived. They showed their badges at the door and walked in. Flickering lights, glitter balls, and scantily clad ladies greeted them. A long bar ran along the right-hand wall, well stocked with drinks. Tables and chairs were set up around a circular stage, on which were 4 poles, but only 2 girls were currently dancing. Above the stage hung an object covered in a blue silk sheet. Cunningham looked up at it. A birdcage, he said. That's the main attraction, said Bolton. And how would you know that? Same reason I knew this place was a strip club. I'd been here before. Gonna get a drink and watch. It starts in a few minutes. As Bolton went off to buy drinks, Cunningham phoned Helen. It's me. How are you? There was a heavy sigh. I'm all right. We did some shopping, as you suggested. We've also been doing a lot of talking. Good. Talking's healthy. Bolton returned 5 minutes later with 2 cokes. Do you think Mr. Mercer was a regular here? Asked Bolton. Hard to tell, replied Cunningham, but I think his wife knows more than she's letting on. Any man who keeps a card from a strip club, though, in his wallet is either stupid or innocent. Meaning what? Meaning that it probably wasn't an issue. Cunningham sipped on his drink. What are you hoping to find here? I want to know if he was here the night he disappeared. If he was, maybe someone remembers seeing him. Like one of his dancers, the barman and waitresses. And was it just him, or all 3 of them? What did they do? How did they seem? Probably not too difficult to imagine what they were doing or how they seemed, said Bolton with a smile. The lights suddenly changed. Here we go, said Bolton. You're gonna love this. Hold on to your dick. The lights had changed to a brilliant neon blue, and now the birdcage began to descend from the roof. It descended to 2 feet above the center of the stage, where it halted, suspended from the roof by a wire. Everyone in the room had gone quiet. And then a slow, sexy tune began to play over the speakers. As it did so, the silk drapery around the cage began to furl upwards, slowly revealing a pair of ankles, then a pair of smooth thighs, followed by a cascade of blue feathers that covered the rump area. As more and more was revealed, it became clear how stunning and intricate the costume was, and how beautiful and delicate the woman. She was dressed like a bluebird in a feathered bra and a mask that partially covered her face. She was leaning forward with her hands on the bars, her bottom sticking out behind her in a provocative manner. Cunningham lowered his glass. She now began her performance, a sensual, erotic dance, using the bars to rub herself against, to hang from, to weave in and out of. Halfway through this, she unhooked her feathered bra and dropped it onto the stage. Cunningham watched as people now began to throw scrunched-up banknotes into the cage, whooping and cheering their appreciation. As more and more money landed in the cage, she removed her G-string, so that she was now completely naked, her perfect goddess body up there for all to see. And almost as soon as she had fully exposed herself to her adoring public, the silk drapery fell back around the cage, and the show was over. As the lights returned to normal again, Bolton grinned at Cunningham. I told you you'd love it. All right, that's enough time wasting. He stood up. Let's go and find the manager. They asked at the bar and waited. Good evening, gentlemen. They both turned at the same time. The dancer they had just been watching, now wrapped in a blue satin robe, was standing before them. Hi, said Cunningham. Listen, that was incredible. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Which part of me did you like best? Cunningham laughed in an embarrassed manner. Sorry, Detective. Did I make you blush? How do you? The barman said so. You wanted to see me? Cunningham raised his eyebrows. You're the manager? Yes. Violet Schornberg. What can I do for you? Cunningham tried to look professional again. He fished in his pocket and pulled out some photographs. Do you recognize any of these men? She took them from him and studied them. Yes, they come in from time to time. Why? Are they in trouble? One of them's dead, the other two are missing. Were they in here last Friday? Yes, they were. They had a couple of lap dances each. They had their own girls they preferred. Good tippers. Are these girls working tonight? They are. Jasmine, Amber and Clover. Jasmine's about to go on stage, but I think Amber and Clover are on a break. Let me find you out for you. She disappeared and soon returned with two gorgeous-looking girls. These gentlemen are police. They want to know about the lawyers. I dance for a Finnegan, said Amber. Clover dances for a Mercer. She spoke with a foreign accent. Anything out of the ordinary happened last Friday? Amber frowned. Not that I recall. They seemed their usual jovial selves, especially Johnny. Clover smiled. He's always telling me he wants to marry me. Always saying how beautiful I am. Clover, too, was foreign. What time did they leave? Around about 2 a.m. They were pissed out of their skulls. Thank you, said Cunningham. You've both been very helpful. At 10 o'clock, Cunningham and Bolton were sitting in Bolton's car, eating fish and chips on their laps with tiny wooden forks. God, these are bloody useless, said Cunningham. He discarded the fork and just used his fingers. Did the coroner estimated time of death? Asked Bolton. You obviously weren't listening. He said Mercer had been dead for at least a week, which means he most likely died that night. I wonder what we're looking at here. 3 colleagues, by the sounds of it, always went out together, very good friends. Are we looking at 3 murders here? Or are we looking at a victim and 2 possible suspects? They were all drunk, according to Amber. What if alcohol was the catalyst for a fight, an argument that went too far, perhaps? Perhaps. But as I said earlier on, we can only speculate. I'll speak to the forensics boys in the morning, ask them if they have anything. They finished their suppers and talked a little more about things in general. I never actually asked you, said Bolton. But what did you do before you came here? The same job. I just wanted a change for a scene. Why? Well, you can't stay in one place forever. What made you want to become a detective? Cunningham picked at his teeth. I started out as a lowly policeman, patrolling the streets, making sure people were safe from crime. I had a colleague I usually went around with. We were very good friends. His wife died. They had just got married a few months before. He loved her to bits. She was all he would talk about on our rounds, what Katie was getting up to, the wedding plans, etc. When she died, it was like the life was sucked out of him. He left the force. I tried to help him, tried to be there for him, someone he could speak to about things, but he just shut down. I never saw him again after that. He moved elsewhere. A year later, we heard through the grapevine that he had gone missing. To cut a long story short, they never found him. I remember thinking how incompetent the detectives were. That's actually what made me want to become a detective, so I could be better than the ones who failed my friend. I suppose it were like, if I was able to help people by solving crimes and mysteries, I could make up for not helping him. He looked at Bolton. Pathetic, really. Not at all. Anyway, I don't think my wife thanks me for the move here. Why? Helen has schizophrenia. She was diagnosed with it only a year ago. Change is very scary for her. There was a silence in the car. Cunningham took a sip from his beer can. We're dealing with it. She's on medication and seeing a psychiatrist, but she's pregnant, and that's not helping. She hates this town. She thinks everything and everyone is against her. I'm sorry, said Bolton quietly. That's tough. Yeah, especially when it's a member of your family. That reminds me I need to call her. He reached into his pocket and then into another. Oh, damn. I left my phone at the club. Do you want me to drive you back there? Cunningham shook his head. No, I'll walk. I need the air. Cunningham walked back to the club. It took him only 15 minutes. When he arrived, there was no bouncer on the door. The door, however, was not locked, and he went in. The place, which had been so busy and lively the last time he had seen it, was now silent and empty. There was no one behind the bar, nobody cleaning up. The glitter balls were still. "Hello?" he called out. He waited for any kind of reply, but there was nothing. He called out again, but still nothing. He found a door marked private and knocked. When no one responded to that, he opened it and found himself in a dingy corridor. He was in the change rooms and staff quarters. At the end of the corridor was an open door. Beyond it there were stairs. He took these stairs and ended up in what was obviously the basement. There was absolute silence. He opened a door to his right. Somebody was standing just behind it. Somebody or something, he couldn't immediately tell. It was covered from head to foot in shiny black leather, with only little holes for the eyes and mouth. It had a dog collar on, from which hung a lead. Cunningham let out a start and involuntarily leapt back away from it, but the figure made no move towards him. He stared at it for a moment, and he saw now a pair of dark, almost lifeless eyes behind the mask. But it was most definitely alive. "Did my gimp scare you?" Cunningham almost jumped again at the sound of her voice. He spun round. Miss Schornberg was standing in the corridor behind him, but she seemed to have gone through a radical change in her appearance. She was now dressed in a black leather bodice and tight-fitting leather shorts. Her dark hair was pinned up tightly behind her head. She had black eyeliner, and wrapped around her throat was a necklace, formed from a chain. "Miss Schornberg?" "No. Now I am Madame Corbeau." "Welcome to my dungeon, detective. Won't you come in?" Cunningham now realized that the room into which the door had opened was set up as a dominatrix's dungeon. She walked in. As she passed the gimp, she grabbed his lead and yanked him with her into this sordid space in which Cunningham now found himself. She dragged the gimp over to a wooden post and attached him to it with the end of the lead. "Stay there and don't make a fucking sound or I'll whip you. You hear me?" The gimp nodded. She slapped him hard across his face. "Hey," said Cunningham, "was that really necessary?" She smiled at him. "Oh, don't worry about him, detective. He likes it. It's a lifestyle thing. Did you come through your phone?" "Yes. I tried to call out, but not to worry. I'll fetch it for you now." She left the room. Cunningham now found himself alone with the gimp. They stared at each other in silence. The gimp stood very still, a slight sound of breathing mixed with the creaking of smooth leather as his shoulder rose and fell were the only sounds he made. He appeared to be looking at Cunningham as if from the point of view of an animal being scrutinized in a zoo. "Are you okay?" he asked. The gimp made no reply. "You can talk to me if you want. I won't tell." Still nothing. Cunningham moved further into the room. He looked around him. A padded cross with restraints on it was positioned against one wall. Similarly, he noticed a long wooden bench with more restraints on it. Around the rest of the walls hung whips, paddles, canes, gag and balls, etc. 3 cages were set up in the middle of the room, but these were not bird cages. These were more like cages used to hang bodies in days gone by, where the crows could come along and feast on the dead flesh and eyeballs. He suddenly realized that corbeau was crow in French. "So what goes on in here?" he asked the gimp. "Don't bother. He can't talk." Madame Corbeau had returned with his phone. "Can't talk, or not allowed to talk." Again she smiled. "Can't talk. He's a mute." Cunningham looked back at the gimp again. "Does he have a name?" She shrugged. "Gimp." Gimp was still staring at them. Madame Corbeau suddenly saw him. "What the fuck are you looking at?" she snapped. He lowered his head. "How long have you been doing this?" asked Cunningham, putting the phone back in his suit pocket. "About 8 years. Give or take a few months. I enjoy the lifestyle." "And stripping, is that a lifestyle too?" "Of course. It gives me pleasure to be admired and revered by men." "And what about drooled over?" "That too," she said with a smile. "Dominance is something I have always enjoyed, even as a child. I used to use my younger brothers as servants. I used to get them to fetch things for me, do errands, etc. My parents would tell me off sometimes, but I didn't care. Back then it was more akin to just being a bossy sister. When I got older, I took it to a new level. They stared at each other for a few moments. Do you like to be dominated, detective? After a second or two, he replied, No. May I ask in what capacity you do this? Who are your clients? She raised an eyebrow. You want names, detective? No, what I mean is this an extra thing you offer men who come to the club? Yes, but it's quite exclusive. Only regulars get my special services. Rich regulars. What about the 3 lawyers? She shook her head. No, they weren't that regular. Cunningham nodded and sighed. Okay. He started to leave. Oh, by the way, do you have CCTV cameras in your club? I do. Do you record images from it? They're just there for show, I'm afraid. In a strip club? That's not very good security. My girls know how to handle themselves, and my bouncers are very good at their jobs. I'll see myself out, said Cunningham. He turned to the gimp. Good night, sir. When he had gone, she locked everything up, turned out the lights in the club, and returned to her dungeon. She closed the door behind her. Just you and me now, David. She moved slowly towards him. You know, I owe you a reward. You've been a very good boy. She was holding something in her hand, which she watched cautiously through his eye holes. It was a mechanical device, which she now proceeded to attach to his ankle. There you are, all rigged up. Cunningham returned home to an empty house. Helen was obviously staying overnight with Jenny. He was glad she had someone to talk to, a place where she could feel safe. But it would help if she took her medication. Helen didn't like taking her medication. She said it made her feel drowsy. Cunningham poured milk into a saucepan and proceeded to heat it over the hob. While he waited, he went into the bedroom and closed his curtains. The bedroom looked out over the road in front of the house. There was usually a street lamp right outside, but it hadn't been working for some time. That's why he didn't see the black car sitting in the shadows. The man inside watched as Cunningham closed his curtains. It was now 11:30 at night. He would stay for another few hours, and then head back. It was a few days later. The sun was out, and the children were digging around in a sandpit in the play park. The little boy had been digging a very deep hole in the sand. Mummy, it's very smelly in here, he called. It's just an earthy smell, sweetheart, she replied, not looking up from her book. The child continued to dig a little more. Mummy, look what I found, he suddenly shouted. Did you find treasure? She asked, still not looking up. I don't know what it is, said the boy, peering at it. Come and have a look. Reluctantly, she put down her book and came over. Cunningham peered over the coroner's shoulder at the body in the sand. Is it one of them? Asked the coroner. Yes, replied Cunningham. It's Finnegan. His wife will have to be informed. I'll do that. Check the neck, would you? The coroner brushed away sand from under the man's chin. It's the same ligature marks. The chain. I'll have to compare them, of course, but it seems logical. My men will check for forensic evidence, but there is nothing on the last body that they could find that might be our killer's DNA. Bolton came up to him. Can I have a word? They stepped away from the crime scene. Do you think this is to do with the case they've been working on together? Asked Bolton. I was starting to think that myself. It might be worth going back to their law offices and having another word with their boss. Bolton nodded. There's something puzzling about these burials, though, said Cunningham. What's that? Asked Bolton. Well, look where this one is. Who buries a body in a children's sandpit? Mercer's body was found in a shallow grave in a popular dog-walking area. You're saying these bodies were meant to be found? Asked Bolton. Cunningham nodded. Yeah. And if that's the case, then why? Is the killer trying to tell us something? Is he showing off? Does he want these men to be vilified, pilloried? I got to these bastards and look what I did to them, sort of thing? Bolton nodded. They were all defense lawyers. They defended scum. And if they were good, they might well have got some of the scum off scot-free. And that wouldn't sit well with their victims. These are revenge killings, said Bolton. As Cunningham pulled up in his car, Gina Finnegan was just coming out of her front door with a large bag of clothes. When she saw Cunningham step out, she knew what had happened. She dropped the bag of clothes on the doorstep. "No!" she cried. Cunningham ran up to her. "It's all right, ma'am. It's all right." As she clutched onto him, pouring out her grief, he remembered Helen doing the same thing a few days ago, and he thought in a split second about the baby. Was it such a good idea after all? Here was this woman holding on to him and crying because her husband had been strangled to death and dumped in a sandpit. Helen was right. There was too much badness in this world. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into her ear. "Why?" she sobbed. "I don't know. I'm going to do all I can to find out, I promise." He helped her to her feet. "Come on, let's go inside." She left the bag of clothes where they had fallen and allowed herself to be held back over the threshold. Cunningham handed Mrs. Finnegan some hot tea and sat down next to her. "Do you have any relatives you can call?" he asked gently. She nodded, her hand over her eyes. "What kind of man was your husband, Mrs. Finnegan?" It took her a moment to answer. "Hard-working, obsessed with his job, but a wonderful family man. We don't have any children, but what I mean is he was a good and faithful husband. He obviously had very close friends. Do you know their other halves?" "No, I never even knew his friends. I wasn't really interested. You said that one of them had been found already?" "Yes. I'm sorry for the other wives. Being a widow was never something a wife wants to be." Cunningham stayed with her for half an hour before he left her. She saw him to the front door. "Oh, God, the dry cleaning," she said. "Can I take that somewhere for you?" asked Cunningham. "Oh, thank you. It just needs to go down the dry cleaners down the road. It's on the corner. Is that okay?" "It's my pleasure," replied Cunningham. He entered the dry cleaners with a bag of clothes and dumped it on the counter. "The name's Finnegan," said Cunningham. The woman nodded and began going through the stuff, checking pockets just in case. All she found was a small slip of paper. She handed it to Cunningham, and he left. He got back into his car and called Bolton. "Any luck?" he asked. "Not sure. I asked about old cases, and you're right, they've got a lot of people off, a few high-profile ones quite recently, so I'll try looking into those. How's Mrs. Finnegan?" "Not good. I'll speak to you later." He hung up, then immediately called the coroner. "Anything?" he asked. "Nothing yet. They did find another card from the Birdcage in his wallet." "Yeah, well, we know that you're there." "Oh well, keep me posted." "I will do." The gimp was curled up in his large chest. It was late, but he had no idea what time. Probably early hours. He'd been awake for a long time, thinking. He often did a lot of thinking when he was alone at night, when there was no mistress to serve. He thought about mountains. Tall, graceful Munros, huge ice-capped ones like the Matterhorn and Everest. He loved mountains, because they seemed bigger and greater than mortal man or woman. These mountains had been on this earth throughout millennia. They bore witness to all the man's history, and they were indestructible, just like the human soul. Humans climb mountains to prove that they are just as great, that there are no heights they cannot scale. This morning, he was thinking about the Canadian Rockies. He'd been thinking about them for a while now, about how a nice trip on the mountaineer train through that magnificent scenery would be. Perhaps it would help to remind his soul that it was stronger than it realized. Cunningham's phone rang. He scrambled for it, still half asleep. "Hello?" "Cunningham, it's Bolton. I'm sorry to call you so early. What's wrong? Have they found another body?" "They've found a body, but it's not our third guy. The reason I'm telling you is because this victim has a very familiar calling card on him." "You're kidding me. The fourth victim linked with the Birdcage?" "Yeah, but this guy's been dead in his house for a while. He's a little decomposed." "Longer than our other victims, do you think?" "Difficult to tell. But listen, you remember I was telling you about those recent cases? Barton rang me up and said there was another case going back 8 years where Finnegan got a client of some sex rap. There was a furious outcry. It's in my car. You can see it when you arrive." "Okay. Where are you?" "It's an address on Bewley Street." I'll meet you there. It took him 20 minutes to drive there. When he arrived, however, Bolton wasn't around. Where did Sergeant Bolton go? He asked an officer. He got a call and just took off. Just like that? Just like that, sir. Cunningham frowned. He went over to look at the body and speak to Torrance. Morning. ID? Adrian Garner, age 52. Do you want to know what his occupation was? Lawyer? No. Private investigator. Cunningham studied the body on the stretcher. A private investigator. He clicked his tongue several times. Now that's interesting. And he had a calling card from the Birdcage, just like the other victims. This case gets more interesting the more bodies we find. And yet we still haven't found McDermott's. Perhaps we're not going to, said Torrance. At least not a dead one, anyway. Cunningham nodded. I think it's time we started looking for our killer. Bolton parked his car next to the scrapyard and waited. The voice on the other end of the line had been quite muffled. I have information for you, it said. Who is this? I don't want to tell you. I have something to give you in person. What's this information regarding? The man you're looking for. The man who killed those lawyers. Where can I meet you? I don't want to advertise this. I want to keep it quiet. Come alone. The Greenside scrapyard. I'll be there in 10 minutes. All right. Just one other thing. How did you get this number? This is my personal work phone. Let's just say I'm a man who knows how to get things. And with that, he had hung up. Bolton had considered calling Cunningham right away and telling him, but in a split-second decision, he had decided not to. Now he was here, waiting for this mysterious contact. The new file he had got from Barton was lying on the passenger seat beside him. He hadn't looked at it yet. Bolton now picked up and opened it up. He had at least browsed through it while he waited. He had hardly begun to peruse the file when his eye was caught by something on the first page. Bolton's mouth opened a fraction, and then he saw the car begin to approach. It slowed to a crawl as it got nearer. Bolton got out. The driver wound down his window. Are you the person who called? The interior light was off, and there were no lights nearby, so he didn't see the driver. It's also the reason he didn't see the gun. All he saw was a bright flash, before it went dark again. The man got out. He opened Bolton's passenger door and leaned inside. With the aid of a torch, he found the file. Then he got back into his own car and drove away. Cunningham called Bolton's phone and waited. There was no reply, and eventually went to voicemail. Bolton, this is Cunningham. Call me ASAP. 15 minutes later, after Bolton had still not called him, Cunningham tried again. Bolton, where the hell are you? It was only after another 15 minutes that Cunningham began to get worried. He was at the station by now. He made his way to the control room. I need you to track Bolton's phone for me. Cunningham saw Bolton's car and his headlights, and his partner lying on the ground, surrounded by blood. He screeched to his own car to a halt and jumped out. He radioed for an ambulance and crouched down to give Bolton mouth-to-mouth. Later, as he was running with the stretcher along the hospital corridor, he clutched Bolton's hand. Hang in there, Thomas. You hear me? Just hang in there. Cunningham hung about the operating theatre for an hour before a doctor came out to him. Well, he asked, desperate for any news. We don't know. He's lost a lot of blood. We had to give him a transfusion. We were able to remove the object he was not shot with. You mean the bullet, Doctor? That's what it's called. Usually, but he wasn't shot with a regular bullet. We're still not sure what it is. Cunningham frowned. What do you mean? We removed a mangled piece of gold with what looked like precious stones in it. Come again? The doctor nodded. You heard me. It looks like it's either a ring or perhaps an earring. You boys can have a closer look. Thank you, Doctor. He frowned. Why shoot somebody with an earring? Is something like that even going to be lethal? Anything fired from a gun that has any kind of sharp points is going to do damage. It depends on what that object is and how powerful the gun. Something like diamonds, which are very hard, would do serious damage. Cunningham didn't go home. He stayed at the hospital until the morning, drinking black coffee and pacing the corridors. Helen had gone back to stay with Jenny again, so it wouldn't be as if he was leaving her alone in the house. Bolton was a good friend. He had shown him how things worked when he and Helen had first arrived, shown them around parts of the town, suggested good bars and restaurants. He was also a good police officer who was passionate about his job. He was amusing and fun to work with, just like his last friend. Funny how history repeats itself. Who the hell was behind this? Was it McDermott? And if so, why? What was all this about? Detectives were meant to detect, but right now he couldn't think properly. No solutions formed in his head. Their best bet now was to find out exactly what happened after they left the club. The CCTV cameras at the Birdcage didn't work, but the rest of the town's CCTV cameras might have picked them up. Where did they go? Which route did they take? Where was the crime scene? Where were these men killed? Cunningham wanted to know all this. He also wanted to know why someone had tried to kill Bolton. And then, for the first time, his thoughts came into focus. The file. His first port of call when he left the hospital was the impound, where Bolton's car had been towed. The forensics teams would be going over every inch of that car and the crime scene itself. "Did you find any files in the car?" he asked the attendant. "No, but nothing's been touched. Forensic will be here in an hour." "Let me have a look." He searched but could not find. Bolton had said on the phone that he had had the file with him in the car. If the file wasn't here anymore, then that meant only one thing. Someone didn't want Bolton to see it. And if that was so, then the identity of the killer was in that file. Was this the person whom Finnegan had got off a sex rap? Why kill the lawyer who kept you out of prison? Unless that lawyer knew something he shouldn't. He spoke to forensics at 2 o'clock that afternoon. "We found a set of tyre treads at the scene which don't match Bolton's car. The treads lead up to Bolton, but they go no further. There are also a set of footprints that are inconsistent with Bolton's. Someone shot him and then stole the files. But what the hell was Bolton doing there in the first place? According to one of the officers at the scene, he got a phone call and took off. We'll need to get a look at this phone. Find out who called him." The voice was muffled, but perfectly clear. Cunningham listened several times to the recording. "Do you think that's McDermott?" Cunningham shrugged. "Is there any way of clearing it up? Of taking away the muffle?" "I'll work on it." Cunningham thought for a second. "You might not have to." They played the tape to Sheila in her living room. "I can't tell. It's too muffled." "You can't tell whether that's your own husband?" asked Cunningham, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. But Sheila caught it clear enough. "No," she said with feeling. "I can't tell. But that's maybe just because I'm a little messed up right now. Or perhaps because I don't want my husband to turn out to be a murderer. Or maybe it's because it's not his voice, Detective." "Do you have any other recordings of his voice that we could compare this one to, like a Holiday video or something like that?" "No, we never had a video recorder, and I can't think what other recordings I would have." At 3 o'clock, Cunningham was back at the law offices of Barton and Forrester. He stood outside the burnt shell of a building, still saturated in the water from the firemen's hoses. Someone had obviously done a thorough job of making sure that file, or any backup copies of it, never saw the light of day again. Cunningham leaned against his car and closed his eyes. He needed sleep, but he couldn't afford any, not with his colleague lying in the hospital. He went back to the police station to see how the technician was coming along with the recording. "Still working on it," he said. Cunningham went to the canteen for something to eat. He sat at a table on his own, alone with his confused thoughts. He thought about phoning Helen, but he didn't have the energy. He chewed on a pre-packed sandwich and brooded. 3 lawyers on a night out. Good friends, but perhaps with a dark secret between them. Were these lawyers corrupt? He thought about the dead private investigator. Was he keeping tabs on them? And if so, then who had hired him and why? What was he trying to find out? He would need to know exactly what kind of commissions this Adrian Garner took on. They had loaded boxes of files and papers from Garner's house and put it into evidence. He would have to troll through them to find out if there was any information on what Garner was investigating. But it was unlikely he would find any. The killer was too smart. And what about this earring idea? There was clearly a reason for it. Did this killer think he was funny? Did he like to tease and make sick jokes? Perhaps it was a wedding ring, which had been fired. Married to death. Where was their primary murder scene? Suddenly he realized he had forgotten to ask how Garner had been murdered. He called Torrance. It was different. The lawyers were killed by a chain around their necks. Garner was shot. With a bullet or an earring? Bullet. Cunningham shook his head. This doesn't make sense. What's your take on this earring thing? It's a strange one, I agree. If there's some meaning behind it, I don't know what it is. Do we know what kind of gun Garner was shot with? Asked Cunningham. I have no idea. I sent the bullet to ballistics. They should get back to me soon. Madame Corbeau sat on a chair in her dungeon, with her legs stretched out towards the gimp, who was kneeling on the floor in front of her. Lick my boot, she ordered. The gimp did as he was told. Madame Corbeau smiled. You know, you're so quiet. The only sound you make is when you cry. The gimp didn't stop licking. Pain is a strange thing. It can be arousing, or it can be unpleasant. But it can make you feel alive. Any extreme emotion makes you feel alive. She slapped his face suddenly, like that. How did that make you feel? The gimp carried on licking. Shall I get Alex to come down? He's been on that bar for a while now. She put through a call on her mobile and waited. Alex answered. Get someone else to tend bar for a while, she said. She hung up. You can stop that now. Amber was doing her makeup in the changing rooms. She was on in 15 minutes. She was trying to stay calm, but that was difficult. It was constantly on her mind, like a nightmare she couldn't shake. Things had been very tense among the girls since the police had shown up, asking about those lawyers. Clover came in from her dance, breathing heavily, sweat glistening on her brow. She looked at her friend. Are we going to talk about it? No, replied Amber. Clover closed her eyes. What are we going to do? Nothing. It never happened. Do you want to get in trouble? But we know. So? There's nothing we can do about it. She looked up at her. They're dead. She stood up and began walking out the door. What are you afraid of, Amber? She stopped. Many things. Alex attached the device to the gimp's exposed ankle. He typed something into a keypad. That's the lowest voltage it goes. Thank you, Alex, said Madame Corbeau. Now, David, we've tried this before, and we didn't get very far. She spoke softly to him. Now, I know you can talk. You just need a bit of encouragement, that's all. And I believe very strongly that I am the person who can break that silence. So we'll start with the lowest setting first. She pressed a remote control in her hand. The gimp flinched, but he made no sound. Remember, I can make this last a long time. The longer you stay silent, the more this will hurt. Crank it up, Alex. Alex adjusted the voltage. She shocked him again. This time he let out a whimper. That's not enough, David. I need to really hear you. She shocked him again, this time for longer. The whimper now turned into a long grunt of pain. Now we're getting somewhere, she said. Amber wrapped her legs around the pole and let herself slide to the floor. Dancing was her life. Since she was a child, she had loved it. She loved the way it made her feel. What she was doing now was a far cry from her dreams of joining a ballet, but she needed the money. If she said anything, if any of them said anything, the game was over. She dreaded to think what Alex and Madame Corbeau were doing to their gimp in the dungeon. None of them had ever been able to speak to him, but they all knew the truth. He was screaming and crying now in sheer agony. Madame Corbeau was stroking his head soothingly, while Alex administered the shocks. That's it, she said. Just let it all out. Let your voice speak. Express how you're feeling. Tell me whatever's on your mind. Cunningham returned to his house around 5 o'clock in the evening. He hadn't slept yet. The chief inspector had told him to go home and get some rest. Bolton would be taken care of. He parked his car on the drive and headed inside. Before he was in, he could hear the phone ringing. He snatched it up after the fourth ring. Cunningham. Nicholas, it's Jenny. Thank God I've got a hold of you. Why, what's wrong? Is Helen all right? That's just it. I don't know. She left here this morning and she hasn't answered her mobile or the house phone. I've been phoning all day. A sudden chill froze Cunningham's entire body. He stood there for a moment, the receiver in his ear. Nick, you still there? Yeah, I'm here. Where did Helen say she was going? Back home. Have you not seen her either? No, I haven't seen Helen since she left for yours yesterday. Oh, my God, said Jenny. Cunningham pushed open the door to the chief inspector's office. He's got my wife. What are you talking about? First he calls me Bolton and now he talks to my wife? Calm down. Tell me what's happened. She's missing. Cunningham was tearing his hair out. He refused the seat the chief offered him. He started hyperventilating. "Oh my God," he said, almost in tears. "Helen's schizophrenic. She's scared and confused at the best of times. If he has her, she'll never get over this. And if anything happens to her, neither will I." When was the last time anyone saw her? This morning. All right, we'll put a broadcast out for her. We'll get her picture on the local and national news. The chief was dialing number already. Police investigating the murders of 2 lawyers in Midchapel, near Manchester, are now searching for the wife of the detective in charge of the investigation, Nicholas Cunningham. Helen Cunningham has not been seen or heard of in 24 hours, and police are treating the disappearance as suspicious. In addition, they are looking for this man, Daniel McDermott, in connection with the disappearance. Anybody with information on the whereabouts of either of these 2 people are urged to contact police immediately. Claire Mercer was watching the news in her dressing gown. She stared at the television screen without moving. When the telephone rang, she knew who it would be. "Have you seen it?" asked the voice on the other end. "I'm watching it now," she said. "I don't know what to make of it." "Make of it what you will. It has no bearing on the case." "Do you think I don't know?" "I don't care." Claire Mercer sighed heavily. "I hate this. I really hate this." "Just don't break down now, Claire. That's all I'm going to say." 3 days had passed, and no news of Helen or McDermott. Why had he gone after Helen? To warn him off? If he wanted to warn him off, why not come after Cunningham himself? Perhaps he would. Cunningham was seated in his living room with a bottle of whiskey and a glass. The curtains were closed. He downed the glass in one gulp. This whole case didn't make any sense. There were no leads. CCTV hadn't picked up the lawyers around town that night. It was like they had simply disappeared. Meanwhile, McDermott was out there with Helen. He punched the sofa pillows several times. 3 days. She hadn't been seen in 3 days. There had been no calls, no sightings, nothing. He hadn't been able to sleep. He'd lain awake at nights, his mind going over every possible horrific thing that McDermott could do. Was she already dead? Helen's own words about the atrocities in this world kept playing over and over, like a CD on a nightmarish loop that can't be changed. What was this about? What was in that previous court case file that McDermott didn't want anybody to see? And what had Garner been on to? He got up and went into the bedroom to get changed. As he took off his suit jacket, a piece of paper fell out of the pocket and fluttered to the floor. He picked it up and glanced at it. It was what the lady in the dry cleaners had removed from Mrs. Flanagan's clothing. There was a number on it. He would have to return it to her. Suddenly, something whacked against his window. He jumped in fright. He ran over and yanked back the curtains. Nothing. He put his suit jacket back on and went outside. He went round to the window and had a look. Something had hit it. That something was lying on the grass. It was an envelope. His heart started to pound. He picked it up and was about to rip it open when he heard a cough. He glanced round sharply. The headlights came on and the black car sped away. Cunningham raced towards his own car and jumped in. He shoved the keys into the ignition and put his foot to the floor. He chased the car out onto the main road and followed hard on its tail as it careered towards the outskirts of town. He got onto his mobile phone and called the control room. "This is Cunningham. I'm in pursuit of a black Audi heading out along Greyfriars Road towards the station. Have you got a license number?" "Yes, but I can't read it. The plates are too dirty. I think it's McDermott behind the wheel. I need backup now." Cunningham accelerated as the Audi began to pull away from him. "Oh, no, you don't." But whoever was driving the car was not about to slow down, and he knew where he was going. He suddenly veered off the road towards the level crossing. The lights of a train could be seen in the distance. In the next second the barrier came down, but the Audi didn't stop. Its roof smashed through the barrier as it was lowering and shot over the tracks, blasting through the barrier on the far side and disappearing into the night. Cunningham screeched to his car to a halt as the train rushed past. "Shit!" he screamed, thumping the wheel in anger. It must have been the exhaustion that finally made him sleep that night, but his dreams were not pleasant. He dreamt about his old colleague, about the day he received the news of his wife's death. All Cunningham saw were his eyes, the look of despair, of shock. They brimmed with tears. Cunningham had put his arm around his friend at that moment, and held him. With all his will he wanted to bring her back from him. But he couldn't. Not even police can bring people back from the dead. He felt the helplessness, the frustration and the anguish all over again. as strong in the dream as they had been that day. When he woke, his eyes were wet. The next morning, Cunningham watched as a member of the forensic team opened the envelope in the lab. He poured its contents out onto the work surface. They were a collection of passport-sized photos of young women. As Cunningham began sifting through them, he suddenly stopped. That's Amber. She's one of the dancers at the Birdcage. And that's Clover, another dancer. He frowned. What is this? Cunningham opened the seal on the evidence box from Garner's flat and emptied the contents onto his desk. A small box of his own calling cards was amongst the belongings. Adrian Garner, private investigator. Below that was a number and email address. He started shifting through the files now, looking for anything significant. It was not until a few moments later that something made him stop what he was doing. He picked up the box of cards again and looked at the number. He'd seen that number before. But where? In the next second, he remembered. He reached into his suit pocket and retrieved the slip of paper that was in Mrs. Finnegan's clothing. Cunningham entered the interview room with Robert Tiplady, who had been assigned to the case in Bolton's place. Gina Finnegan was sitting at the table, her handbag in front of her. She did not smile at him. "Why am I here?" she asked sullenly. Cunningham closed the door and sat down. "You're here because I need to ask you about something. You could have just phoned me." "Well, this is something that's best discussed in person." He paused. "A few days ago, we found a man called Adrian Garner in his flat. He'd been dead for a week. We found a card from the Birdcage on his person, as we did of your husband and Mercer. We also found his own calling cards. So? Well, you see, the thing is, the number on this calling card matched the number on this particular bit of paper that was in your clothing." He had removed the paper from a file. Gina Finnegan stared at it without moving. After a moment, she sighed and smiled. "Okay. I hired him. For what? I was convinced I had a stalker. I had been getting these odd phone calls for about 2 weeks. The person would just phone and then hang up every time I answered. Then one afternoon I was coming home from the supermarket when I saw somebody come through the gate from my back garden and get into a car. He drove away, but not before I managed to get his license number. What make of car was it? I don't know, but it was a dark maroon, disgusting if you ask me. What did the man look like? He was wearing a hoodie. Did you report this to the police? No. Why not? Because my husband was a defense lawyer, and I knew there were people in the police force who didn't like him, and therefore probably didn't like me either. So instead of broadcasting the fact that I might have a stalker, I hired a private investigator instead. I see. What I find rather too coincidental, though, is the link with the Birdcage. Could you perhaps explain that? I have no idea, but I could take a guess. She leaned forward across the table. This is a small town. He's a man with needs, and the Birdcage is a very popular venue. It could just be nothing more than coincidence, Detective. After she had left, Cunningham and Tiplady stayed behind in the interview room. What do you think? Asked Tiplady. I don't buy it for a moment. We've got 3 dead men here, all linked with the Birdcage. We've got a suspect on the run. What about the different MO styles? The 2 lawyers were strangled. Garner was shot. She could be right. These could be 2 separate incidents. We're talking about a single man who lived 3 blocks from the strip club, and there's nothing fishy here. Okay, said Cunningham. Then perhaps we should be looking into this stalker. Could it have been McDermott? She said she'd never met him, so she wouldn't have recognized him, even if she had seen him. Cunningham drummed his fingers on the table note. You know, this could be the reason there's 3 men are dead. What if Finnegan found out his colleague was stalking his wife and confronted him about it? On a drunken night out, said Tiplady. And if he said it in front of Mercer, then the 2 of them had to be silenced. And then he killed the investigator. Perhaps he knew Gardner was on his trail. Exactly. Cunningham smiled and nodded. The door suddenly opened and an officer stuck his head in. Cunningham, I was looking for you. There's been a sighting of your wife. Cunningham pulled into a petrol station on the outskirts of Midchapel. He got out and locked his car, then headed into the shop. A man in a cap stood behind the counter. Good afternoon, I'm Detective Cunningham. Ah, said the assistant. Are you here about the girl? Did you see the woman? Yes, sir. He came around the counter. They were outside in the forecourt. They? She was with a man.
They were arguing. What did this man look like? Asked Cunningham, flipping open his notebook. I didn't see his face, he was turned away from me, but she was really shouting at him. About what? I couldn't hear individual words. Are you sure this was the same woman as the one in the television? Positive. I'm very good with faces. What happened next? Well, I just thought it was a lover's tips, so I went back to work. The next time I looked, they were gone. Cunningham was staring at him. Lover's tip? Did it appear that she knew him? The assistant shrugged. When was this? 4 days ago. What time? Early afternoon. I don't know exactly when, maybe around lunchtime? Your lunchtime or somebody else's? Well, I just mean 1 o'clockish. Can I get a look at your CCTV cameras? We've only got one and it's broken. Cunningham threw his hands in the air. Sorry, we're getting it repaired in a couple of days. Well, that doesn't help me, does it? Cunningham walked back out to his car and slammed the door. He cursed. She had been here on the day she disappeared. But why? This was nowhere near Jenny's house and she didn't have a car. Where was she going? There was a bus stop on the other side of the street. He got out and strolled over there. He looked at the destinations. There was only one bus that stopped here, and that took people into Manchester. Helen didn't like big cities, so she wouldn't be going there. He sat down on the bench. Who was the man she had been arguing with? Was it McDermott? Cunningham's phone suddenly rang. It was Tip Lady. You're not going to believe this, he said. We've just had another call. What is it? A woman said Helen ran up to her, probably on the day she went missing. Helen had said there was something following her. The woman said she looked terrified, but then she just ran off. Where was this? A park in Manchester. Come again? That's where the sighting was. What the hell is she doing there? Helen hates big cities. I don't know, said Tip Lady. Which park? Rochdale Park. I think it's somewhere near the centre. Cunningham hung up. His mind was racing now. The argument with a strange man at the petrol station, directly opposite a bus station with buses that went to Manchester. What if McDermott had confronted her in the petrol station, leaving her no option but to catch the first bus to wherever it was going? What if McDermott had followed her there in his car? What did that bastard want with her? Was it something specific, or was it a threat and a warning to back off? There had been no ransom demand yet. And maybe there wasn't going to be. McDermott was a murderer and a possible stalker. Cunningham crossed the road again, got back into his car and headed for Manchester. When he arrived, he located the police headquarters. When he walked in, he identified himself and explained the situation. He was shown into an interview room. Did this woman say where in Manchester this had happened? Asked Inspector Jones. Rochdale Park. That's quite near here, said the inspector, frowning. I'm surprised she didn't come here for help. She doesn't know Manchester, Inspector. I understand. Do you have a photo of your wife on you? Yes, I do. Cunningham opened his wallet and pulled out a small picture. He slid it across the table to the inspector. As a professional courtesy, we'll get posters made up and send them out to every hospital, police station and homeless shelter in the city. It's been on the television, but not everybody watches that. If she's seen again, we need to make sure people are aware of who she is. And what about this man, McDermott? I'll fax you a photo when I get back to Midchapel. Very good. Cunningham didn't go back to Midchapel immediately. He stayed a while in the city. He wanted to do some looking of his own. He asked directions to Rochdale Park and made his way there. It was a small, leafy space with a children's play area. At this moment in time it was quiet, except for a homeless man sleeping under a tree. His hair was long and scruffy, and his face and hands were soiled. He was clutching something shiny, a fine gold chain. Cunningham advanced towards him to take a closer look. It was a feminine product, completely out of place on a beggar's person. Cautiously, he stretched out his hand and gently peeled the necklace out of the man's grasp. He froze. It was Helen's necklace, the one he had bought for her for their wedding anniversary. The beggar suddenly woke up. "Hey, that's mine!" he yelled. He began grappling with Cunningham, trying to snatch it back from him. Cunningham pinned the man against the tree. "Where the hell did you get this?" he screamed. "It's mine! I didn't steal it! Give it back! This is my wife's, you bastard! Where is she?" "The woman in the red jacket? She dropped it. I tried to run after her, but she was too fast." "You saw her? Which direction did she go?" That way, out of the park and down Rochdale Lane. Cunningham looked where the beggar was pointing, down a dingy-looking cobbled street. Well, I don't know Manchester all that well, so I'm going to need a guide. He pulled the man to his feet. You're coming with me. The beggar wasn't about to argue anymore. Cunningham looked too serious to mess with, and if he played his cards right and cooperated, he might get a bit of money out of this. He walked with Cunningham down the lane. Where does this lead to? Asked Cunningham. Nowhere, it's a dead end. There's an abandoned warehouse at the bottom. Cunningham looked towards the double doors at the end of the lane, with 2 broken panes of rusted glass. He started to run. When he was there, he yanked the doors open and dashed inside. Helen! His voice echoed. The place seemed deserted. Wooden stairs led to an upstairs mezzanine level. He ran up them 2 at a time. When he reached the top, he stopped and looked around him. And then he saw it. A patch of something that looked at first sight like spilt motor oil. He went over to inspect it. He had been doing this job long enough now to recognize the look and smell of dried blood. Oh, Christ, he said under his breath. What's wrong? Asked the beggar, who was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Did you see anybody follow her on down here? Asked Cunningham. No, I tried to chase after her myself, but you thought you would just give up and keep the necklace for yourself. The beggar lowered his head. What did you do immediately after that? I went to try and flog it, but then I had second thoughts. So you don't know if anyone else followed her after she ran in there? No. Cunningham ran back down the steps. Listen, I'm not paying you a dime, but you are coming with me to the police headquarters. Look, I'm sorry I took the necklace. I was just... Shut up, said Cunningham. An hour later, police had the site cordoned off, and a sample of the blood had been taken to the labs for testing. Helen is B positive, and she's pregnant. Do you have anything else with her DNA on it? Cunningham began to shake his head, and then stopped. Possibly. Hang on. He rushed out to his car and leaned inside. In the trash section between the 2 front seats, he found a wrapped-up piece of discarded chewing gum, which Helen had been chewing on a car journey, and which he still had. The tests will take a few hours. Why don't you go back home and we'll give you a call as soon as it comes. Cunningham sighed. All right, he said. But the minute, we'll call you. Violet Schornberg was getting changed in her private dressing room. She was transforming from the blue bird into the dominatrix, Madame Corbeau. Alex was there too, getting in the way. He was kissing her neck. Alex, stop, she said. Why? He replied. Because I can't put on my makeup when you're doing that. He chuckled and backed off. I love you, you know that. Said Miss Schornberg, as she applied black lipstick to her mouth. I like mean bitches. She winked at him in the mirror. I like hunky barmen, especially ones who share the same taste in dominance and pain. It's the dominant species that will survive after all. She put her lipstick away. Now, down to business. What was it you wanted to see me about so urgently? The plumbing in the house. It's going to need to be fixed. Well, you can do that, can't you? I'm not a plumber. Well, you'll have to improvise then. You know we can't have an outsider poking around in there. What do you suggest I do? You're the mechanical genius, Alex. Work it out. She started to apply light eyeshadow. Anyway, I don't really give a shit about their comfort. They'll put up with whatever I provide for them. She paused. Are you joining me tonight? Alex smiled and nodded. Good. I don't like working alone. She went into her jewelry box. I'm really pissed about that earring, she said. What earring? I told you I lost one of my diamond ones. They cost me a fortune. Alex now cleared his throat. Spit it out, said Miss Schornberg. I'm worried. That's not like you. What if they find McDermott? They're not going to find him. I've told you. And what about the detective's wife? Miss Schornberg turned to him. That's not our problem. David was curled up again in his chest, waiting for Madame Corbeau. He shook like a leaf. The electric shock treatment was getting more frequent these days. She didn't want to help him. She just wanted to bully him. She wanted to break him so much that he would give up his silence, so that she could feel big and proud of herself, in the knowledge that she had got a self-induced mute to speak. through torture. But it didn't work like that. It wasn't torture that would encourage him to speak again. All he had to do was hold out a little while longer and be a very good boy. Cunningham was looking at pictures of his wife. They had been married 4 years. The first 3 years had been bliss. They talked about what they were going to do in the future. They enjoyed spending time in each other's company. Every weekend they would curl up together on the sofa and either watch a film or listen to music. Cunningham enjoyed classical, whereas Helen preferred a bit of jazz. When Helen had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, all of that had stopped. It was like she completely changed. Now they would curl up together on the sofa and cry. She had always seemed a bit odd, but that's what had attracted Cunningham to her. However, the odd behaviour had begun to get worse, which was what had led to the assessment and her diagnosis. Cunningham looked at their wedding picture. It had been a beautiful day. There had been so much anticipation and hope for their life ahead. Cunningham was sobbing quietly when the phone rang. He composed himself and lifted the receiver. Cunningham? Detective. Good afternoon. It's Inspector Jones here from Manchester. Yes? I'm afraid the blood is your wife's. There was silence. So what happens now? Asked Cunningham. We put out a massive search for her. I'll use as many men as I can afford. We'll find her, Detective. That was a big pool of blood, Inspector. Possibly from a stab wound. Then where's the body? Why take it away? Why not just leave it there? Because he wanted to make sure it wasn't found, suggested Cunningham. Perhaps. I'll be in touch as soon as possible. When Cunningham had hung up the phone, he went straight to the bathroom and threw up. He staggered through into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. He slashed his arms several times, allowing the blood to drip onto the floor. He reached for his wallet and opened it up. He removed the photo of Helen, the one the inspector had copied for the posters. He started to cry again. This was the passport photo that she had taken when they went abroad for their honeymoon. She had given it to him after they had returned. Suddenly, Cunningham stopped crying. His tangled, despairing thoughts suddenly began to solidify. Cunningham bandaged his arms and drove at top speed to the station. When he arrived, he went straight to the evidence room and signed out an item. The envelope containing the photos of the dancers, which had been dumped outside his house. He looked at the photos again. 12 girls in total. All serious expressions, no smiling. All passport-sized. Because they were passport photos. Both the dancers he had spoken to at the club had been foreign. Or did he want to bet that the rest of them were also foreign? These girls, he muttered. They're not supposed to be here. And now his whole view on this case began to change before his eyes. He began packing away the pictures and now got out the box of Garner's belongings. What was it he had been investigating? Was it possibly that these girls were illegal immigrants, brought into the country with false passports, brought in to become strippers and lap dancers? These girls were not just illegal immigrants, they were sex workers. Cunningham now began thinking about McDermott and the sex scandal that Finnegan's client had been involved in. Was McDermott messed up in sex crimes? Did he know the defendant? Once again, images of Helen under duress flashed into his mind. He tried to push them away. He found the Birdcage card again. Why had somebody given them those photos? To secretly let him know what was going on? Passport photographs, though, were not proof. He would have to find that for himself. He was still staring at the card when he realized there was something bothering him about it. What on earth was it? He had probably stared at it for a full 10 minutes when he went into the other evidence boxes and removed the other cards they had found on Finnegan and Mercer. And now he knew what was wrong. There was something different about these cards. At each corner of the Birdcage, two at either end of the base and one at the top, was a black dot. But the card that they had found on Garner did not have these two dots. Why? He leaned back in the chair. Why? What was the significance of these dots? What did they mean? 3 dots? 3 lawyers? Three bodies. There's still a body out there. McDermott? He stared suddenly at the positioning of the dots. Draw a line between them and you've got a triangle. Cunningham suddenly leapt out of the chair and headed upstairs to his office. On his wall was a large map of the town. He took a blank marker and put a dot on the woods where Mercer's body had been found. He then put a dot where they had found Finnegan. He took a ruler and drew a line between the 2 points, a straight diagonal line between 2 green spaces. He drew his eyes in an imaginary line to this left, until they rested on another green space. 2 parks and a wood. He drew another 2 lines between them and stared at an almost perfect triangle. "That's where the 3rd body is," he exclaimed. Police had descended on the area in a matter of hours, but it wasn't a park anymore. It was now a building site. The work was stopped and the builders removed. They began using ground-penetrating radar, and by nightfall they had found what they were looking for. Luckily, it had not been built over yet. Lights were brought in and set up around the unearthed body of Daniel McDermott. "We were looking for the wrong man," said Cunningham. "I beg his pardon." "So who are we after?" asked Tiplady. "I'm not sure, but things are a little clearer now." "And what about your wife? Who is it that's got her?" Cunningham paid a visit to Bolton in the hospital. He was still unconscious, but he was now stable. He then went to see the coroner in the mortuary. McDermott was strangled with the same chain as his colleagues. But Bolton and Garner were shot, meaning there are 2 different killers. Why 2? Obviously working together? Cunningham was quiet for a moment, as he looked at the body. To shoot someone's cold, but it's quick. Strangulation, especially with a chain, is sadistic and personal. It means the victims probably knew their killer. He mused for a while longer. "Did you manage to get anything off that earring?" "Yes, foreign DNA. I was quite surprised to find it. I didn't think it would survive." "Well, that's something." As he left, he encountered Tiplady in the corridor. "I was coming to find you. That car you were chasing the other day, it may have been spotted." "Where?" "Outside the Birdcage." Cunningham smiled and nodded. "I want that place staked out. I don't want to make any moves until I have enough evidence for arrests, and if you see that car again, contact me immediately. But call my landline. My mobile's out of batteries." He gave Tiplady the number for his phone and left. When Cunningham got in, he locked all the doors and windows, went to the drinks cupboard, got out the whiskey and sat down on the sofa in the living room. There was enough to get drunk on. He sat and brooded, sipping slowly. He was thinking about his old colleague again. He had never forgotten the last day he had spoken to him, nor would he, until the day he died. He was so full of woe that nothing Cunningham said gave him any comfort. And now it was like that every time he spoke to Helen. His words had no comfort. Was it him? Was he just the kind of person that people didn't feel comforted by? He had failed his friend all those years ago. Now he had had to watch as he failed Helen. And now she had vanished too. If he didn't find her... The tears ran down Cunningham's face, and then his phone rang. The car pulled up outside Cunningham's house. The man went into the glove compartment and removed the pistol. He opened it up and checked the chamber. There were 2 bullets. He closed it again. He looked towards the house. He stared at it for a long time, then slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. Suddenly the passenger door popped open and Cunningham slid into the seat beside him. At the same time, the door on his right was opened and a truncheon was placed against his throat, while a hand secured his wrist. "Give it up," said Tiplady. The gimp let go of the gun. He sat perfectly still. "Give us a moment, would you?" said Cunningham. "What?" Cunningham stared at Tiplady. "I'll be right outside," he said.
Tip Lady closed the door. The gimp still didn't move. He stared at the floor. Good evening. Nice to meet you again. The gimp said nothing. I was perfectly nice to you when we last met, wasn't I? So why come to kill me? There was silence. It's nothing to do with you, is it? You're under orders. From Madame Corbeau, by any chance? The gimp now slowly turned his head and looked at Cunningham. I know you can't talk, so let me fill in the blanks. You can just nod to confirm a few things, okay? To begin with, I can talk, said the gimp. Cunningham stared at him. The voice that came from behind the mask sounded croaky, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. But croaky or otherwise, Cunningham recognized it immediately. Take off your mask, he said. The gimp slowly raised his hands to his head and pulled off his shiny leather face that he had worn for the past 5 years. It had almost become a part of him. Cunningham stared at David. He looked more ravaged than he remembered him, no longer the fresh-faced policeman that had walked the beat with him many years. My God, said Cunningham. It's you. Hello, Nick, said David. Cunningham continued to stare at his friend. Now it's you that's lost for words. So why don't you let me fill in the blanks? David ran his hands through his hair slowly, as if enjoying the feeling. When Katie died, I had to move on. I moved here to try and start over, but it didn't work. I stopped going out, stopped speaking to people. I shut myself in my house for weeks on end. It was during that time that I had a nervous breakdown. I literally stopped talking. I couldn't cope with the fact that I had lost the love of my life in such a cruel way. I spent months doing nothing. One day, one of my neighbors decided he just had to help me. He knew this woman that owned some strip club in town called the Birdcage. Said she was looking to hire a cleaner. I wouldn't be required to talk. He took me round there and introduced me. She seemed very nice, very caring, understood the situation and didn't make any demands of me. She gave me the job there and then. I could tell she liked me, something about the way she looked at me. The job was easy enough, quite tiring but not taxing. I had to clean the club every night after all the punters had left. David paused. Well, after a few months of working there, something happened. I had finished my shift and was on my way home when I realized I had left one of the doors unlocked back at the club. I had to drive back. I had a key and I let myself in the back way. And then I heard it. The commotion, raised voices coming from the bar area. I went to have a look. I peered round the door. There were 6 of them, beautiful girls I hadn't seen before. At that point in time, however, they didn't look beautiful. They looked disheveled, like they had been awake for hours. And they looked scared too. Probably because Alex had his hand around the throat of one of them, while Miss Shorner was screaming at her. "You're mine now, bitch!" she was shouting. She then proceeded to tell the rest of them the rules. She said that if anybody told they were in the country illegally, they wouldn't live long enough to see the next New Year. But she was clever. If someone talked, it wasn't them who would die. It was one of their colleagues. In other words, talk and you'll be responsible for the death of your friends. She told them sex work was a lucrative business in Britain and they would make a lot of money. So when they went home to their families, they would bring them back a lot of cash. It was at that point that Miss Shorner caught sight of me. I tried to run, but I didn't get far. There were 3 other men there who chased me down. I was dragged downstairs and locked in the dungeon, a room I had cleaned many times. Alex and Miss Shorner came to me later. "Oh, David, David," she said. "You shouldn't have been there. And now I have no other option. You're going to have to be my slave. But don't worry, I'll take care of you." Over the next 5 years I lived in that dungeon. I slept in a chest that was locked at night, so no chance of getting up and going to the toilet. I was allowed to shower only twice a week. A cold shower, mind you, not a hot one. She relished her control over me. She tortured me and beat me whenever she wanted to. Jesus. Cunningham sighed. What about the lawyers? What do you know about them? They were regulars. Miss Shorner knew one of them personally. She was his client once. Cunningham smiled. Finnegan's client in their sex case. Now it made sense. And now he was her client, along with his friends. Yes. What did she do to them? Dominated them? She had to be careful, though. There couldn't be too much physical interaction, otherwise there were the risk of marks, and that wouldn't do. Well, they couldn't risk their wives knowing what was going on, could they? David wiped sweat from his brow. Do you mind if I wind the window down? Go ahead. David did so. He closed his eyes against the cool breeze that blew in through the gap. Miss Shorner wanted more girls. Finnegan was the one helping her to get the girls into the country. He knew how the system worked, knew who to speak to about the false passports. Then why did this end in murder? Asked Cunningham. That night, they came in as usual. Madame Corbeau locked them in the cages. Then the mood changed. She began to say something to them. She was speaking quietly. This mask doesn't have ear holes, so I couldn't hear all that was going on. I only caught a little bit of what was being said, but it seemed to upset the lawyers no end. In a very short space of time they had gone from being jovial to being petrified. Cunningham noticed that David had begun to shake. He put his hand on his arm. You're okay, David. I promise. Just tell me what happened. They were tied up, so there was no escape. She released them one by one. And then she... David burst into tears. He sat there for several minutes, his body racked with emotion. What did she do, David? How did she kill them? She took the chain from around her neck, and she slowly throttled them to death, taking great pleasure as she did so. Inflicting pain aroused her, but murder was something she hadn't done before. She killed McDermott first, while the other two watched. Finnegan was the last to die. Now, David, this is very important. You said you heard bits of what was being said in that conversation. What did you hear? All I remember hearing was that it wasn't personal, that someone had paid her to do this. Did she say who that someone was? David sighed. I didn't catch that bit. He looked at Cunningham. Sorry. Not your fault. What happened after that? She instructed me to bury them. Why you? Why? She liked to torture me, remember? Torture can be mental as well as physical. For example, she liked to call me by my name, almost as if to remind me of who I was, once. But isn't getting you to bury the bodies a tad risky? Not if you put in certain controls. And Madame Corbeau is good at ways to control people. He pointed to his ankle. Something was attached to it. You see that? That's a prisoner tagging device that's been specifically modified. Modified to do what? To give me a fatal electric shock if I stray too far. Cunningham's eyes widened. You're shitting me. Believe me, I wish I was. Cunningham leaned down to examine it. How does this work exactly? It has a tracking device on it and a range monitor. The range can be altered and set. If I break the range, it will automatically give me an electric shock that could potentially kill me. If for whatever reason it should fail, it can be overridden by Madame Corbeau herself, who is a remote control device that is manually operated. So if I managed somehow to escape from the dungeon, I would never have to get very far. She ordered me to bury the bodies and adjusted the range accordingly. She knows where the police station is, so the range was always set well away from there. But you could have... There are a few things I could have done, yes. But I was warned not to do anything stupid. If I did, they would hurt one of the girls, and I wasn't going to let that happen. David leaned his head back against the seat. But I had to do something. This was my chance to finally get my revenge on that bitch. If I was clever, I could link these killings back to the birdcage and her. So you buried the bodies in a triangle and plotted those points on the cards. That way we could find them. David nodded. It was the only thing I could think of. He looked at Cunningham, but it obviously worked. What about the private investigator, Garner? David didn't answer for a while. Finally, he said, As I said, I had no choice. I was told where he lived in order to kill him. Again, I left a card on his body to link him to the birdcage. What did Garner have to do with this? Who hired him? I don't know. She never gave me any information, just gave me orders. Cunningham stared hard at him. And Bolton? Again, David was silent for a moment. When you left your mobile at the club, she knew it was yours. Alex found it. He knows all about electrical devices. He's the one who modified the ankle tag. He put a bug on it, so they could know what you were saying. When Bolton phoned you and said that he'd found Finnegan's old file, she panicked. You overheard this? Yes. She said her name was in that file and they needed to get it back. Alex made the call, and I drove round there. And then you burnt down the law offices to make doubly sure that the file would completely disappear, so that Miss Shorner wouldn't be linked with this case. Exactly. Whose earring is that? Hers. I found it the other day in the dungeon and picked it up, in case it could come in handy. I saw a film once where a killer had fired a diamond at someone, and that gave me the idea. He paused. How is Bolton? Alive? David nodded. Well, I'm glad about that. How did you get your hands on those photos? Asked Cunningham. David actually laughed now. Madame Corbeau had asked Alex to lock me in for the night. But he was drunk, so he must not have done it properly. Halfway through the night I discovered I could open it. Well, then I knew what I had to do. I had to find evidence that would prove these girls were here illegally. I knew Madame Corbeau had those photos stored away somewhere. It took me about half an hour before I found them. I stuffed them down inside my suit and went back to bed. Madame Corbeau wanted me to keep tabs on you. So I would park out here and just keep an eye on your movements. David paused. I recognized you as soon as I saw you that night. I wanted so much to speak to you, but I just couldn't. Madame Corbeau tried several times to get me to speak, using the electric shocks as stimulation. But that's not what gets a mute like me to talk. I remembered how you had tried to help me. I wanted to talk to you about the way I was feeling back then, but I was too upset at the time. I remember feeling guilty. Guilty? About what? I felt like I'd somehow let you down by not responding to your kindness. You were my best friend. When I saw you again for the first time in several years, I knew that if there was anyone who was going to get me to talk again, it would be you. Cunningham put his hand on David's shoulder. There were tears in both men's eyes now. Cunningham wiped his eyes. David was staring at the windscreen. I killed a man, Nick. I pulled the trigger and I shot him. What am I going to do? You didn't have a choice, replied Cunningham. Has Alex been awake recently? I wouldn't know. What else can you tell me about the girls? They stay in a house together somewhere. A van comes to pick them up at the end of the day. I've heard Alex and Miss Shorner talking about different clients for sex. A van comes to pick them up at the end of the night. I've heard Alex and Miss Shorner talking about different clients for sex. After the club closes, they drive the girls to different locations around the town. Most of the money these girls make goes straight to Alex and Miss Shorner. He looked at Cunningham. They're slaves. Why is she in that file? What was this old sex case about exactly? Trafficking. But Finnegan was bent as a buggered drainpipe. She managed to get off. Don't ask me how. But she paid him a small fortune, I know that. They became friends, and when Finnegan realized how much money could be made in the illegal sex industry, he became her partner too.
He introduced his colleagues to her. Cunningham was taking in all this information and shuffling it around in his mind to try and make sense of it. David, I have to ask you something. My wife is missing. Did you? No, he said at once. No one knows what's happened to your wife, not even Miss Shorner. Cunningham sighed. You know she's schizophrenic. I'm sorry, said David. Yeah, it's been tough recently. They were silent for a while. How did you survive, David? It's not as if you could go home and at the end of the day and forget it all. David smiled. Mountains, he replied. Come again? I thought about mountains. Every mountain I'd ever heard of, and after all that, all the ones I hadn't. Why mountains? They remind me of man's defiance against something seemingly unconquerable, like torture and imprisonment. When you stand at the base of a mountain and look up at her overbearing countenance, you think that she is impossible to climb, impossible to get the better of. There she stands, looking down at you from her great height, putting the fear of God into you. Those who are brave enough will not be intimidated. Cunningham watched his friend's eyes. They were sharper now than before. That's what she was to me. A mountain. Merely that, nothing more. And if I kept my nerve, I would get the better of her. David suddenly glanced at Cunningham's arm. He had rolled up his sleeve, and now David could see the bandages. What happened to your arm? I cut myself. David stared at him. I used to do that. And then he knew. You said they knew nothing about my wife. Yes. I don't think her disappearance has anything to do with this case. You're right. I don't think it does either. David sighed. What do we do now? He asked. You need to come back with us to the station. That's not going to be possible. I can't get this tag off. If I go anywhere near the police station, it will activate it. Why can't you take it off? Asked Cunningham. David laughed dryly. You think if I was able to take it off, I would still be here? If I try and take this off, it will shock me. It can only be taken off by Miss Shorner or Alex, who have the code. Well, let's see if we can do something about that. He opened the door. Tip lady, we're going to need some help here. A specialist from the bomb squad was called in to assist, and 20 minutes later the man arrived. Although it's not a bomb, it's a device that is set to go off if tampered with, which makes it very much like one. Just sit tight. I'll see what I can do. It took the specialist half an hour to figure out how to get it off safely. They left the tag in the car and left the car where it was, so as to make it look like nothing was wrong. David was taken to the police station and put in a cell. Cunningham, on the other hand, led a team of officers back to the Birdcage. Alex was behind the bar. Cunningham walked up to him. Evening, Alex. That is your name, right? Yes. I'd like to buy a drink. A nice hot cup of tea, which you can drink in the interrogation room. You're under arrest. Officer, read him his rights. Miss Shorner was in her dungeon. Waiting for a client, are you? Asked Cunningham, poking his head round the door. Detective! What a nice surprise. Or a nasty surprise. Your gimp filed to kill me. Miss Shorner stared at him. I beg your pardon? Yeah. It turns out we're old friends, just like you and Finnegan. Miss Shorner said nothing. Two officers came in through the open door. It's a very nice neck chain you have there. Do you mind if I borrow it? Still Miss Shorner said nothing. One of the officers removed the chain from around her throat and placed it in a plastic bag, while the other officer handcuffed her. She looked down at her wrists. You'll be familiar with those, I'm sure. Cunningham smiled at her. I know. It's a lifestyle thing. Sheila Finnegan was again waiting for Cunningham as he walked into the interrogation room. What the hell do you want from me now? She snapped. Cunningham sat down opposite her. The truth. Excuse me? I'm not going to play games. I have a lot to do. Here's what I think happened. You hired Adrian Garner to keep tabs on your husband and his friends because you suspected that something was up. And I don't know how long it took him or quite how he did it, but Garner discovered quite a lot, didn't he? Not least that he and his friends were having affairs with illegal sex workers who passed themselves off as just simple strippers, or that they had a rendezvous every Friday night in Madame Corbeau's dungeon, but that your husband was himself involved in bringing these girls into the country illegally. You were so angry at this that you shared your findings with the other wives. I think it was you who engineered this plot to have Madame Corbeau murder your cheating husbands during one of their sessions with her. You managed to convince the other two into agreeing. A, because you thought that each needed revenge, but B, because 3 wealthy wives could easily come up with enough money between them to pay Madame Corbeau a generous fee for her services. You met with her and shared Edgar Garner's findings. You then probably blackmailed her by telling her that you would go to the police with this information unless she agreed to do what you asked of her. In that case, she would be allowed to keep her secret and become several £1,000s richer at the same time. But there was a problem. Garner had advised you to go to the police yourself with his findings. If these lawyers suddenly went missing, Garner would know who the main suspect was. So, of course, he had to be bumped off too. Cunningham paused. What do you think, Miss Finnegan? Time for a lawyer?
Cunningham followed Inspector Jones along the hospital corridor. She's been here all along, said the inspector. Even after we sent out the posters, it seems to have taken them a while before anybody clicked. She walked into A&E with the blood all over her and a slightly dazed look. She couldn't explain exactly what had happened to her, but I think we know. The wounds were self-inflicted, Nicholas. Cunningham nodded. Helen was in a private room. She lay serenely under a crisp white sheet. Cunningham pulled up a chair next to her. Her eyes were closed. Eventually she opened them and looked at him. Nick, it's me. She started to cry. I'm so sorry. He took her hand and squeezed it. It's all right, sweetheart. I'm just so glad you're safe. He explained what had been happening and how he thought her disappearance was linked. I just got frightened. I'd gone for a walk to try and clear my head. I thought this man was following me. I argued with him. I told him to keep away from me. I was so scared. His eyes they were like a madman's. I saw a bus coming and jumped on that to escape. I felt sure he was following the bus, and when I got off, I thought I saw him. I ran as fast as I could. I was terrified. I found an abandoned shed, whatever it was. As I lay low in there, my fears and anxieties overwhelmed me. There was a piece of metal lying nearby. That's the last thing I remember. The next thing I knew, I was lying in a ward. She looked at him. I've taken my medication this morning. The two of them were quiet. It was all paranoia. Cunningham laughed. Well, for once, I know how you feel. It was 4 months later. David scrambled up the last bit of the slope before the summit. For several moments he stood, breathing heavily, looking out over the glorious vista of mountains and lakes. Told you I'd beat you up to the top, he said, as Cunningham appeared, puffing and sweating. That last bit was hellish, said Cunningham. Yeah, but it's worth it for the view. Cunningham joined his friend now, and together they stood in contemplative silence. Eventually David said, It's still there, you know. Cunningham nodded. It'll need more time. But look at it this way. You're free, she isn't. David nodded. I know. Thank you for waiting, said a voice. Oh, wow, look who's made it. Helen stuck her finger up at her husband and laughed sarcastically. Well, now you're here, we can break out the hot chocolate and biscuits, said Cunningham. They sat down on a pile of rocks and opened the rucksack. You know, I've been thinking about baby names, said Helen. Yeah? Well, as I was walking up here, I just thought of something. What was that? That I can't come up with a single one I like. Cunningham laughed. How about Arijit? Said David. They both looked at him. What? Said Cunningham. It's an Indian name. What does it mean? It means conqueror of enemies,